Hello, and thank you to the organizers of IAS 2021 for the opportunity to give you this dual keynote lecture on our work to bring cell and gene therapy to resource-limited parts of the world. Since the first bone marrow transplant in 1956, the blood stem cell has been an attractive therapeutic target, including contributing to the first two known cures of HIV infection in Timothy Ray Brown, aka the Berlin patient, and Adam Castillo, aka the London patient. However, this procedure has still not arrived in the most populated parts of the globe, as shown by the maps on the right. The top map shows the population growth, with the darkest areas demonstrating the geographies with the highest populations, and the bottom map showing with stars the locations of the world where bone marrow transplant donor registries are in place. And you can see that there's a very stark distribution gap between the most populated areas and the presence of a bone marrow transplant registry. This is in part due to the complexity of the process involved in a bone marrow transplant. It's complicated, as shown here on this slide, and would take most of the time the keynote to explain each of these steps. The point I want to make with this slide is that without a suitable donor to provide bone marrow for the patient, this process can't even get off the ground. It's a major limitation to making bone marrow transplant accessible to all patients who could benefit from this treatment approach, but it's not the only limitation. As you heard from Dr. Keem in the previous lecture, gene therapies have the potential to reach more patients because they don't require a donor. Instead, a gene therapy approach allows us to use the patient's own blood stem cells to generate the same therapeutic outcome. And this promise has helped gene therapy gain tremendous traction. There are currently more than 375 clinical trials in progress to treat more than 80 different diseases worldwide with gene therapy. And in the last few years, we've seen the first US Food and Drug Administration and European Medicines Agency approvals of gene therapies. Thus, the pipeline for this new treatment paradigm is booming. Unfortunately, the current state of the art for blood stem cell gene therapies requires even more equipment, highly trained personnel, and facilities, which means that the price tags for these approaches, shown on the left, are equal to or greater than that for bone marrow transplant. And this is neither sustainable nor amenable to access, especially in low and middle income countries, as shown by the map here. This is the World Bank's designation of country income based on gross domestic product. And the red crosses are the countries where active gene therapy trials are taking place in the world. Now, it's important to mention here that even in developed countries, few patients have access or the ability to afford these treatments. And importantly, this map shows that low and middle income countries have been excluded from gene therapy development altogether. This also means that as we're developing gene therapies to treat HIV, we are not doing so with the majority of patients who could benefit in mind. If the standard case for HIV on the planet is not included in the development of a gene therapy that should eventually be used to treat those patients, we are probably setting ourselves up for failure. This is simply not acceptable or smart, in my opinion. Instead, I like to think that if we actually tried to face the problems that it would take or that we'd have to cross to get gene therapy in low and middle income countries, we would actually be advancing the technique in a way that could benefit patients everywhere. But to know what problems we face in implementing gene therapy in low and middle income countries, we have to have a clear idea of what the curative gene therapy, in particular for HIV, would need to look like. In this regard, the work of HCAP, or the HIV Cure Africa Acceleration Partnership, and the Sunnylands meeting has already identified a target product profile for an accessible HIV cure. Ultimately, we need to be able to diagnose, treat, and monitor patients with as inexpensive a platform as possible, all of which can be done as a single intervention on an outpatient basis. This means simple and cheap diagnostics, a shot in the arm single treatment, and affordable and non-invasive monitoring to follow patients anywhere in the world that they might exist. With this goal in mind, we have a long way to go and much work to do across many fronts simultaneously. But as was noted in the HCAP summary, there is much that the gene therapy field can learn from and in partnership with the HIV field. It was this expertise in translating HIV treatments in Africa that led my partner, Dr. Cissy Kityo, to form the Global Gene Therapy Initiative in late 2020. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Cissy to talk to you about our efforts to bring gene therapy to low and middle income countries.
Thank you very much, Jen, for the introduction. I've been working with JCRC since 1992. And at that time, we pioneered the use of antiretroviral therapy in sub-Saharan Africa. We also set up a post-recovery model using generic ART later on, because at that time there was no funding for treatment program for HIV. We continued to be very strong advocates for ART access for developing countries. And eventually we became one of the 2 case studies for PEPFAR because we showed that ART provision was possible in developing countries. And this slide shows the journey where we have come from and the developments. We have made big strides in the management of HIV. Treatment started in 1987 with the discovery of AZT, but a reasonably big trial of ART was only done in Africa in 2002. And this was the Dutch study that was funded by Rockefeller Foundation. So treatment for HIV has continued to improve from that time with newer drugs, better drugs, fixed dose combinations, and long-acting ART. And now we are marching to epidemic control by 2030. So the question is, where is the role of HIV cure, including gene therapy, in this long journey? This slide just shows the global numbers of people receiving ART. We started off with very small numbers, and now the future target is 33 million people by 2030 on ART. We've made big strides in providing ART to HIV patients. However, as seen from this slide, from the UNAIDS report, we are seeing a stagnation in the funding. And there is actually a gradual decline in resources available for HIV in low and middle income countries. So with this target of 33 million, how are we going to sustain these patients on ART for 10, 20, or even 30 years moving into the future? That's a big question, and no one knows the answer. So looking at where we have come with the ART scale-up in low and middle-income countries, what are the lessons that we can learn and that we can take to gene therapy? The list of the challenges is long, and I'm not going to go into each one of them. I'll point out a few though, but the key question is, how can we focus on these lessons learned from ART so that upfront we address them for better implementation of gene therapy? One of the most glaring is 17 years from getting the first ART on the market to access in developing countries. How can we shorten this timeline for gene therapy? Advocacy was very central to make ART access, even in the developed countries initially. How can we use advocacy today? We know that we have local advocates for ART in our different countries, but we also have international organizations, including Gates Foundation, NIH, HCAP, for gene therapy. How can we make our voices louder through these mechanisms? the rest of the challenges there, and we are looking at them and seeing how to address them as we move forward with our respective programs. As already mentioned by Jane, the gene therapy pipeline is booming. The prediction is that the US FDA will be approving 10 to 20 cell and gene therapy products per year by 2025. However, we should note that none of these products is happening or being researched on in developing countries. So then how do we become part of access with this big gap? We know that gene therapy is at the frontier of science and could present promising new treatments. Administration, durable, potent, safe, valuable in terms of quality and quantity. So what are we doing to be at the frontier of science? So in order to benefit our patients, I have reached out to many different individuals, organizations, companies, pharma, to see involved and engaged in this advanced science. And always the answer was negative. I got answers like, wait, in 10 minutes we'll come for research in Africa, wait until these things are working in Europe and the US. We cannot ship certain equipment to developing countries. Why don't you use existing drugs that you already have? And more and more. But I didn't stop looking out or reaching out to people until I met this professor called Jane. I had been reading about Jane's work, her presentations, her goals and aspirations. And I called her one morning, it was 1 a.m., and I explained what I wanted to do. And she immediately said yes, very emphatically. She was very enthusiastic and was very well aligned. She said we were aligned with her goals and missions and ambitions. And we struck it off immediately. Our initial conversations quickly identified a network of researchers, clinicians, regulators, and advocates who shared the vision. And this is how the Global Gene Therapy Initiative took form. This slide shows a few of the members. It is not exhaustive. And we did agree as a group that patients need to be at the center, and representatives from each sector relevant to the patient receiving treatment should be included. And this slide also shows the different partner organizations where the working group members hail from. And as I said, this is not exhaustive. We are now a group of about 25 people, and the numbers are increasing. But very importantly, the emphasis is patients, as already shown, and community advocates are at the center of our discussions and are around the table to guide us. We know that there are many other advocates out there, as already mentioned by Jane, including HCAP, NIH, Bill Melinda Gates Foundation, and other HIV organizations that we will be engaging as we move forward. So the GGTI, which is the Global Gene Therapy Initiative, established 4 pillars for successful implementation of the program. And all of us together believe that focused and simultaneous efforts in each of these 4 key areas will greatly accelerate progress. All four things have to be happening simultaneously, not one after the other. We know that funding for these efforts is usually category specific, and the closest to all encompassing funding for those or these efforts is likely to be Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. However, at the core of our work, fundraising efforts are very critical and they are ongoing. One of the key pillars is clinical readiness and implementation, including training and capacity building. We have identified 2 initial sites as a starting point in Uganda and India to build capacity for gene therapy, manufacturing, take stock of existing infrastructure because it is there, and close existing gaps. 2 members of the DGTI have already developed point-of-care diagnostics and monitoring, as we need to monitor gene therapy before we do it and also after. And some of these point-of-care assays are already operational in Uganda and India as well. The 2 selected sites are not the only sites that are able to do gene therapy, but they are a starting point and they can be leveraged to expand gene therapy access on their respective continents. The other area is regulation and policy. Regulation and policy on biotechnology is missing in many countries. And, and working with WHO, local ministries of health, local WHO offices, and parliament will support enactment of laws to support gene therapy research, product development, and approvals. WHO is expected to release a white paper on recommended governance frameworks for gene and cell therapies. And we are working on making Uganda a test case for this implementation. As already mentioned, community outreach and education is very central to informing and engaging the public, and also addressing myths about gene therapy, while at the same time educating them about the benefits. We already have existing advocacy groups who are very active, and these were very active also for ART access, and they continue to be active and engaged in ART programs, and these would be allies in the development of gene therapy. Also, understanding how to communicate and what patients need is critical to the success of the program. Otherwise, if there is a lot of misunderstanding, you may not also get participants into the studies. And then new technology development. Of course, we have to make gene therapy simpler than the current state of the art and to move it forward. We currently have 2 gene therapy products which we are implementing. One was made at NIH by Dr. Tisdale, and this is being licensed to Caring Cross. And another one was developed by Caring Cross, co-founded by Dr. Boro. Dr. Boro is one of the key members of the DGTI. And at this point, we will use the most advanced base of care manufacturing currently available. And we call it gene therapy in a box. So this is much simpler than what Jen showed previously, but we also aim to get simpler than the gene therapy in a box. So, but we know that technology shown in the previous slide will not be sustainable as we aim to scale up to other sites on the continent. Therefore, we need to also be thinking about the future of gene therapy delivery. 2 DGTI members, one of whom is Jen, are also developing technologies which could potentially be used in a very minimal ex vivo gene therapy manufacturing, or even in vivo gene therapy delivery. And these are already very promising programs. So we know that as we move ahead to work on gene therapy, we need to collaborate. We know that there are already other groups in the US and other advocates in Africa and other developing countries. So we need collaboration in order to have success of this project. We have clinical trials and we need a lot of collaboration. We have access issues and we need to take lessons from what we learned from the ART scale-up. We need to refine manufacturing, we need to develop infrastructure. And as already mentioned very clearly, all these things have to happen simultaneously if we are to accelerate progress. So in summary, can we include low and middle income countries in gene and cell therapy development? The answer is yes. The goal is very ambitious. This is 2 years. So we have to work round the clock within GGTI, but also collaborators to make sure that this happens. Early involvement in gene therapy development is critical for realizing gene therapy success. I think that is already very clear. A successful gene therapy equals one-time treatment with curative potential, as opposed to taking ART for lifelong. And so the more people at all levels thinking about gene therapy, the faster we will surely get there. On that note, I would like to thank everybody for listening to us and for your attention. Thank you very much.